at the beginning, okay. Good, well, welcome to you all. This is, I guess, the first forum of the year, Public Sociology Forum, and we are indeed extremely lucky to have Ira Katznelson.
Can you speak up?
Speak up?
Yes, please.
Okay, this is the first forum of the year, and we are very, very lucky to have Ira Katznelson with us tonight. I've known Ira not since he was in his nappies, but since he was a young lad in Chicago. Yes, that's what lad he was then. And he has since then done an amazing number of things. His work has been largely concerned with, I think, the specificity of the United States, interested in the beginning in class formation or unformation. Book that we all in sociology read is City Trenches, but also with Ira Zolberg, book on class formation, United States and Europe, and with Margaret Weir, book on education and the significance of class for education in the United States. And he's written on matters of liberalism, which are close to his heart. His book on when affirmative action was white, received an enormous amount of publicity, which I suppose is the foundations for the book that we're here to discuss today, Fear Itself. He's doing an enormous amount for the promotion of social science, including being president of the American Science Association, including being the dean of the graduate faculty at the new school, which he sort of renovated, and he's now president of the SSRC. So he's had a major impact. He is not just a political scientist, he's very much a sociologist, and a historian. So he covers many interdisciplinary fields. I did tell him that the last speaker in the forum burst into tears after he was, Eric Wright, this was, after he was, his work was commented on. I think that was 2 years ago. And he wondered whether he should then get the plane back home. But actually, the commentators today, who commented? Who did comment on those?
No, they were tears of joy.
Dylan and Jihan and Marion. Yes. So, anyway, there's a slight overlap. Anyway, but it turns out that actually these commentators with us today have all got special connections to, sort of kinship connections to Ira. Turns out that Dylan was his undergraduate, Ira was Dylan's undergraduate advisor at the new school. Margaret, well, was actually supervised by Ira, so that's an interesting relationship to see what sort of that produces. And Loic actually was in Chicago at the same time, and they shared a boxing ring together, right?
I wanted to be supervised, but when I got to Chicago, he was already gone.
He knew you were coming.
Leading the way. So anyway, the plan of this evening is that Ira will talk for about 20 minutes about the book, and then we'll go in alphabetical order, comments from 10 to 15 minutes from each of the panelists. Aaron will have, if he so desires, a chance to respond to them, and then we will have a discussion, open discussion about the issues. I think that the book raises many questions about the nature of democracy and the history, the 20th century history, and presumably the future of the United States. So it's very fitting that we have Ira here, so welcome, Ira.
It's a treat to see you all, see so many old good friends and students, and etc. And what Michael didn't say in the introduction is that I first met him at the University of Chicago when he was a shy and retiring graduate student in sociology, and one of the sassiest graduate students I've ever known. Anyway, onward. Look, there's no way in 20 minutes to say what's in this overlong book. But what I'll do is just do 2 or 3 things. I'm going to read 2 paragraphs only because these paragraphs, to me, establish the field of tension, a kind of creative tension that within which that challenged me to write this book. Then I will say just a few words about what motivated me to write a book about the New Deal when there are thousands and thousands of such books. And third, say something about the strategy that I had when I wrote it, a kind of the invisible scaffolding. Maybe it's visible, but which shifts in vantage did I adopt in order to try, at least, to see a very familiar period in a slightly different way. So let me see if I can do that in 20 minutes. Here are the 2 paragraphs. These are from the introduction. A gloom of incomparable force was setting in when the New Deal began. In July 1932, Benito Mussolini celebrated it prematurely how, quote, the liberal state is destined to perish, reporting how worn-out constitutional democracies, and I quote, have been deserted by the peoples who feel it will lead the world to ruin. Mussolini boasted in prose ghost-written by the philosopher Giovanni Gentile that, quote, all the political experiments of our day are anti-liberal. The New Deal's rearrangement of values and institutions and its support for the Western liberal tradition answered this challenge. Its battles were fought on many fronts, from the effort to revive capitalism to the struggle to incorporate the working class and contain the dangerous features of a mass society. Its international objectives were no less weighty, from the mission to defeat Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and militarist Japan, to the desire to keep Soviet communism in check, while maintaining internal solidarity and security in the process. These achievements are especially impressive when one realizes that they had to be accomplished virtually all at once, like a galloping thoroughbred carrying not 1 rider but 4. And the second paragraph I'll read, and then I'll stop the reading, is the following. A wise commentator once wrote of King Lear that the sheer greatness of this work grossly magnifies its defects that stand between certain scenes and their possible perfection, end quote. Esteem for the New Deal, paradoxically, should draw attention to its most profound imperfections. It should motivate efforts to discern the causes of its defects. Seeking to understand not only the New Deal's manifest successes, but also its ironies and limitations, I explore the complicated and sometimes unprincipled relationships between democracy and dictatorship, and between democracy and racism. Eschewing the traditional division separating foreign from domestic affairs, the book examines the fringes of liberal civilization and the ways in which illiberal political orders, both within and outside the United States, influenced key New Deal decisions. Well, in effect, those 2 paragraphs say something about what my motivation was. In the broadest sense, I've been interested for a very long time in the character, the achievements, the limitations, the vulnerabilities, and sometimes the ugliness in the Western liberal political tradition. And by the Western tradition, I've simply used that as a label for a political tradition, at least from Locke forward, grounded in ideas of government by consent, rule of law, individual rights, and political representation. And I'm interested for a long time in 3 sets of transactions between the state and civil society, the state and the economy, the state and other states, about which the liberal political tradition is concerned. That is, if you think about the tradition of political liberalism, it attempts to give answers to the questions of how should transaction rules be established to link state and society, state and other states, and state and economy. There's as it were, a political sociology of differentiation of jumbo structures underneath that political theory. There's an assumption that state and property, sovereignty and property are separate, that there's a separate zone of civil society separate from the state, and that states exist in a global system of states. And the question then is, how should those linkages be crafted? The second set of questions that always comes forward in talking about this tradition are questions of membership and exclusion and inclusion. Who gets to be a liberal citizen? Who gets to enjoy rights? Who gets political representation? Who gets to be a participant in the making of decisions about the relations of state and society, state and economy, state and other states? And what I chose to write about the New Deal, in part because this is a concentrated period in which each of these dimensions was in question for the United States and more globally. That is, first of all, could the Western political tradition actually thrive? Could it compete with these new dictatorships of which Mussolini announced all experiments today are anti-liberal? Could a liberal constitutional democracy actually successfully craft relations between state and state, state and society, state and economy, in conditions of crisis, multi-layers of crisis? And second, the issue of membership, exclusion and inclusion was profoundly discussed and debated, especially with respect to questions of race, in this period of the 1930s and 1940s. That's reason number one. Reason number two, so in a way it was an attempt to choose a moment when political theory was made flesh. The tensions, the contradictions, the challenges, the possibilities. Second reason for writing about the New Deal concerns a word that appears in the title. The word is fear. This is a very presentist motivation. We live in an age of fear, and fear of global terror, so post 9/11, fear of economic insufficiency, etc. Not the same as the 1930s and 40s, but I, not alone, many people are interested in the relationship between fear and democracy. How do democracies grapple with and deal with fearful circumstances? And it struck me some years ago that it would be, might be useful to interrogate a period that was characterized by layerings of fear, and I'll come back to the concept of fear in a moment, because it often tends to be under-theorized. And a third and last motivation was because simply a product of my own surprise when I started to do research. When I first started to write, I thought I was going to write a book that compared the Reagan Revolution to the New Deal, that is, moments of large-scale ideological transformation and how those moments would occur. And then I kept coming across voices that rang out that I had not considered. Here are just four quick such voices. This is Walter Lippmann, June 5th, 1939. Walter Lippmann was the most important op-ed, nobody used the phrase then, but a journalist in America. 3 times he wrote in these 20 years, this is June 5th, 1939, 3 times in these 20 years the American people have had great hope. 3 times they have been greatly disappointed. Now, the historiography of the New Deal, Arthur Schlesinger's great 3 volumes, for example, all have the same structure. They start by saying there's fear and capitalist collapse at the beginning of the Roosevelt administration. By 1936, hope restored. Here's Lippmann saying 3 times, what were the 3 disappointments? The promise of democracy on a global scale after Versailles. Clearly the 30s was not a good period for democracy. The promise of prosperity for modern capitalism in the 1920s, which collapsed in 1929. And the last disappointment, he said, was the New Deal. And that shocked me, surprised me. What did he mean by that? Second voice, Senator James Eastland of Mississippi, January 31st, 1944, in a debate about how soldiers should vote during the Second World War. Now, November of 44 election, after all, took place after D-Day. It was not possible for soldiers to get absentee ballots in the normal way. The Roosevelt administration proposed that every soldier and sailor in the field, and there were 12 million people under arms, should be handed a federal ballot. They would write in Dewey or Roosevelt, and the Army would send them back to the home states. Eastland rose to oppose this idea and said, and I quote, "These boys are fighting to maintain the rights of the states. These boys are fighting to maintain white supremacy." That's the floor of the U.S. Senate. Now you think, well, a crank segregationist. But the bill that passed was not the Roosevelt bill, it was the Eastland-Rankin bill. Rankin, member of the House from Mississippi. It allowed for a federal ballot, but only would be counted where individual state legislatures and governors would approve the use of that ballot. In other words, the Jim Crow South would not count any of these votes because black soldiers could vote if given a federal ballot in the field. That was a voice that cried out. Then there was just, one more. E.B. White, some of you will know for great children's Charlotte's Web and so on. Letter to the New York Herald Tribune, November 29, 1947. I live in an age of fear. Well, 1947, not 1933 or 35, or not even 1941, 42. I live in an age of fear. So these voices cried out. I wanted to make sense of them. In any event, I worked, I'll take 5 more minutes, just with the following small number of shifts in vantage as an attempt to make sense of this period and its larger meaning. The first is very simple. I treat a longer period than most New Deal histories. I treat the New Deal as including both the Truman as well as Roosevelt administrations. The first reason is simple, maybe even simple-minded enough. Truman would not have been president if not for Roosevelt. He was the last vice president, Roosevelt's 4th term. He was a New Dealer. But really I elongated for 2 different reasons. The first has to do with fear, and the second has to do with the book's central object of analysis, what I really ultimately tried to explain. Fear first. When I use the term analytically, I draw, in the book, I draw on the University of Chicago economist Frank Knight's work of the 1920s on risk, and in which Professor Knight distinguished ordinary risk from circumstances that generate deep anxiety. Ordinary risk happens all the time. People marry. 50% of marriages today don't end well. You take a chance if you marry. You buy a house. You take a chance that it will go up in value. But ordinary risk happens in circumstances where you can assess the parameters within which chance is being taken. You know that 50% of marriages, you know what the data looks like. Fear, Knight taught, is generated in circumstances of deep anxiety when it becomes impossible to understand the parameters within which risk exists. So when capitalism collapsed after 1929, or when these big popular mass dictatorships in Rome, in Moscow, in Berlin, claimed to be better democracies than the constitutional liberal democracies, their challenge, or the level of violence of the Second World War culminating in atomic weapons, etc., created layerings of experiences in which it became, for elites as well as the population, impossible, or at least nearly impossible, to reckon with what the parameters of risk actually were. Those are circumstances that generate fear. We see that this whole period It's not surprising that E.B. White says, I live in an age of fear in 1947, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the violence of the Second War, after the, after so many of these, the discovery of the Holocaust, things that seemed unprecedented. So, to grapple with fear, better to have a longer period. But the second reason for elongating the period has to do with the objective analysis. What we see that we would not have seen if I had stopped, as is traditional, either in 1939, 40, 41, or even 1945, as David Kennedy's wonderful book on the New Deal does. What you wouldn't see is the creation of a two-sided new American state, which did neither side of which existed in 1932-33 when Roosevelt was elected and inaugurated, and both sides of which existed clearly by 1952 when Eisenhower was elected. And what are they? On the one side, and I'll do it in the shorthand version, on the one side, on the domestic side, we got the kind of state that the interest group pluralists like David Truman described in 1951 and 1952. A state that had no a priori sense of public interest. The public interest was the outcome of the provisional politics of democratic competition, but was thick with procedures, hundreds of interest groups, lobby groups, congressional hearings, filibusters, you name it, thick with procedures, thin on public interest. The other side of the national state that was and that state did not exist in 1933. We did not have a big interest group lobby state because government was so small. Only when the New Deal created all the alphabet agencies and whatever did we get a new kind of domestic pluralist state. And on the global side, however, by 1952, we got what in the book I call a crusading state. A state that was strong on public interest, for democracy, against dictatorship, but weak on procedures. The president wants to drop a bomb on Hiroshima, drops a bomb on Hiroshima. Doesn't require any thick procedures. And we live today with the outcome of that dual state. So my question in this book really is, how did we get it? Where did it come from? Where was it fashioned? And that brings me very quickly to the second choice that's made in this book, which is a shift away from the riveting figure of Roosevelt, or even the impressive, interesting figure of Harry Truman, the president, to a focus on Congress. Why Congress? First, the critics, as well as the friends of democracy in this period, believed that liberal democracies could not function well because they had legislatures at their core. Legislatures are polarized. Money talks. There's no sense of public interest. There's no passion. It's all instrumental stuff. Well, if that's the critique, and the New Deal dealt with fear and these different dimensions of public policy, surely it happened through lawmaking in the Congress. And there's very little work, some, but not much, certainly as compared to work on the presidency, in this period. I'll just quote Lippmann one more time. The situation, he wrote on the eve of the inauguration, requires strong medicine. He advocated a grant of, quote, extraordinary powers to the incoming president. The danger we have to fear is not that Congress will give Roosevelt too much power, it will deny him the power he needs. And then he proposed extraordinary authority should be given the president for a period of a year, the widest and fullest powers under the most liberal interpretation of the Constitution. Congress should suspend temporarily the rule of both houses. That's the only way we could solve the problem. And Roosevelt, in his inaugural address, nothing to fear but fear itself, ends by saying, should Congress not act promptly and decisively, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will confront me. I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were invaded by a foreign foe. And the great achievement, the greatest achievement of the New Deal is that that never happened. He did not rule by executive power. Congress was not suspended as Lippmann wanted. Even the 100 Days did things that Roosevelt didn't want, like public works. It was not part of the NIRA as Roosevelt proposed it. So that's the second main shift. The third shift, and I'll stop with this, is within Congress to the American South and to the role of the Democratic Party and its southern wing. Sean Farhang and I wrote about this in Studies in American Political Development in 2005, which is really the point of origin of the work on the South that made its way into this book. There were, in this period, 17 states in the Union. Now, there's racism throughout the country. We'll hear from Loic, I'm sure, about the northern aspect of this. But there still was something very distinctive about the South. There were 17 states in the Union that, by law, mandated racial segregation, that instantiated a system of racial terrorized humiliation by public authority. And those 17 states elected 34 United States senators and a United States Senate of 96 seats. They were, if nothing else, a veto group. They had, there are exceptions to this, but kind of lexical ordering of preferences. The protection of Southern autonomy and race relations came ahead of everything else. And I argue that I argue in the book that only when the Southerners felt secure in race relations, the white South felt secure, were they prepared to be 100% New Dealers, which they in the main were. Once a mass labor movement emerged that tried to organize in the South in the late 30s, once World War II changed the ideological discourse about racism, once a series of other things happened that unsettled the white South, began to bolt from the Democratic Party in critical ways, signified for me, above all, by the way in which Southern Democrats joined Republicans not only on the soldier voting Eastland bill, but on Taft-Hartley especially, which transformed and undermined the possibility of labor ever becoming a national political class in the United States. In any event, the last thing I'll say is if you were to map Southern preferences in Congress onto the outcome, including the dual state outcome that I talk about, you would find a perfect match. That is to say, the Southerners were the most interested in and most supportive of an assertive American foreign policy and military policy, often, in my taste, for the good, as in voting for a peacetime draft in 1940 and 41. We wouldn't have had any army before Pearl Harbor if not for the American South, but also being the key instrument in shaping the excesses of that crusading state, especially in the late 40s, and also in shaping the domestic state, thick with procedures and thin with public interest, which was a state that had hundreds, if not thousands, of interest groups, but no special position for labor vis-a-vis capital and the state, as in a quasi-corporatist model of the kind, say, that Walter Reuther, among others, would have wanted. So I'll stop there and say, I'll end by reading one last paragraph. May I read one more paragraph? So this is just the last paragraph of the introduction.
You want to stand up and do it?
No. No.
Not the preacher.
If history plays...
Page
25. The last two paragraphs. If history plays tricks, Southern congressional power in the last era of Jim Crow is a big one. The ability of the New Deal to confront the era's most heinous dictatorships by reshaping liberal democracy required accommodating the most violent and illiberal part of the political system, keeping the South inside the game of democracy. While it would be folly to argue that the members of the southern wing of the Democratic Party alone determined the choices the New Deal made, their relative cohesion and their assessment of policy choices through the filter of an anxious protection of white supremacy often proved decisive. The triumph, in short, cannot be severed from the sorrow. Liberal democracy prospered as a result of an accommodation with racial humiliation and its system of lawful exclusion and principled terror. Each constituted the other like the united double nature of both soul and body in Goethe's Faust. This combination confers a larger message, a lesson that concerns the persistence of emergency, the inescapability of moral ambiguity, and perhaps the inevitability of a politics of discomfiting allies, abroad as well as at home. It also reminds us that not just whether, but also how we find our way truly matters. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ira, for summarizing so well a very, very thick book. And so now
I'm about to be reduced to tears.
this is your friend. So Dylan.
Well, as I think is evident from that summary, this is an incredibly rich intellectual product. I just wanted to say a couple of things because I have this sort of personal connection with Ira that, I wouldn't be a sociologist except for Ira, and it's a sign of his liberal broad-mindedness that he agreed and really to take me on as an undergraduate, where I produced a thesis expounding the Althusserian conceptual underpinnings of Perry Anderson's Passages and Lineages volume in excruciating detail.
The download comes back. Not in tears.
This is just obviously a sign of great patience and a very
compromise
liberal
with the
mind.
sound, right?
So let me turn just to the matter at hand here, just very briefly, and say that I will try to the best of my ability to kind of focus the discussion on what I see as the really central issue for me, in any case. And I'm not speaking as an expert of American political development by any means. But for me, the central argument that links together really the entire thing is this investigation of the historical connection between, on the one hand, the preservation of the Jim Crow South in the 1930s and the relative stability of American political institutions through the years of the Great Depression and World War II. And I think we can formulate Katznelson's main thesis by saying that it was, in fact, the New Deal's political alliance with the Dixiecrats that was a condition of survival for American democracy as such in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. If there is a lesson, he writes, it is not one of retrospective judgment as if the possibility then existed to rescue liberal democracy and pursue racial justice simultaneously. Instead, liberal democracy prospered as a result of an accommodation with racial humiliation and its system of lawful exclusion and principled terror. Again, going back to the Faust quote, each constituted the other like the united double nature of soul and body in Goethe's Faust. So, for Katznelson, it's the alliance with the Jim Crow South that, as the title of the last section of the book puts it, was democracy's price. So the question that I want to sort of probe a little bit is the extent to which that quite controversial argument is in fact plausible. Now I think the place to begin is simply to say that in order for the argument to, I think, work, it's incumbent to show both that there was a real threat to liberal democracy and that there was a real threat to the Southern racial order. Right? These are the two pillars upon which Katznelson's argument, in a sense, rests. I want to begin with asking about the first one, the threat, as it were, of dictatorship. The theme of a threat from dictatorship is really a constant in the book. Just to give you a sense, the United States in 1933 faced a night sky illuminated by barbarism. during the 30s, quote, the United States possessed many of the same features that Hannah Arendt was soon to associate with totalitarianism. Although not facing the same challenges as Weimar, there was, quote, a real set of pitfalls. Confronted by the dictatorships, Roosevelt took the reins of power. It was the South that helped the United States respond to the jibes of the dictatorships that liberal democracies could not restore an effective capitalism or manage class conflict. In other words, for Katznelson, the US in the 30s was an embattled or besieged liberal democratic citadel. What connection does that presentation have with the historical reality of the 1930s? Now, perhaps the first point to make actually comes out very much in Katznelson's own evidence, which is that it doesn't seem to me that the US political elite, in fact, viewed the world in those terms. As Katznelson's own analysis makes clear, the US politicians viewed Mussolini in particular as a congenial figure in this period. In 1932, Roosevelt confided to a friend that he was, quote, keeping in fairly close touch with that admirable Italian gentleman. The US political elite was studying fascism as a model of political organization. And Congress and the President, again, as Katznelson himself shows, awarded the United States Flying Cross to the notorious squadrista Italo Balbo, who is like really the worst of the worst. This is a murderer and a thug, essentially. So, Roosevelt and Congress, like the leaderships of all the other Western liberal democracies in the 30s, also took active steps to cut off the flow of arms to the Spanish loyalists in the Spanish Civil War. Right? Thereby, they played a very important part in handing the country to Franco, which played a huge role in the debacle of 1939 and the subsequent outcome of World War II, obviously. So I wonder about the notion of a fear of threats from a generic category of dictatorships. It seems this is very little in evidence, because the fascist regimes in the 1930s were certainly quite compatible with US interests. More broadly, I think that one could query Katznelson's portrayal of World War II as a struggle to advance the well-being of liberal democracy across the globe, as well as his description of the national security state that emerged in the 1940s as a crusading state that would campaign virtually without limits on behalf of liberal democracy. This sits somewhat oddly with some historical facts. Constitutional niceties generally were always subordinate in US foreign policy to economic considerations when the two conflicted. Again, the example of Spain, 1936, but also Italy, 1948, or Chile, 1973, or Arbenz, 1954. Where the two priorities of liberal democracy and private ownership conflicted, the US was quite willing to jettison the former. So the presentation of the geopolitical position of the mid-century US, in this sense, it seems to me, is somewhat questionable. Throughout the entire period under discussion in Fear itself, the US never faced any real threats to its mainland. Even the desperate Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which its architect immediately understood to be a disaster for the Japanese Empire, was in fact a defensive move provoked by a US oil embargo. The assault was designed to secure the conditions for the notorious Ichigo offensive through Southeast Asia to seize raw materials. It's also quite questionable whether Hitler ever had ambitions to attack the United States, although that's a somewhat more controversial one. Now, how much time do I have, Michael?
You have, I haven't noticed. We started, so you have 12 minutes.
I have 12 minutes.
You've had 7 minutes, actually. Okay. I should be honest with you, right?
Keep going, it's good.
Yeah. So we have this problem on the international side. What about the domestic threats? I will simply say that here one wonders. Fear itself presents, in a sense, the latter-day Southern populism of Huey Long, Strom Thurmond, George Wallace as the bearers of a political movement with a family resemblance to European fascism. There's not much evidence behind that, in fact. yes, these were movements that mobilized poor white farmers and were nasty to their political opponents as well as criticizing Wall Street. But, and of course there's also Charles Lindbergh's silly flirtations with the fascist powers, but one wonders whether taken together we can see a real threat to democracy in the same sense as the European interwar countries that suffered from fascism. In fact, quite unlike how Katznelson portrays the period, there was little discernible threat to liberal democracy in the United States from the entire period from 1933 to 1953, or so I would argue. The second issue, then, is to question the issue of the racial order. If there was one pillar of Katznelson's book as a threat to democracy, the other is the notion that this was saved by a trade-off to compromise on a threat to the racial order. Katznelson's idea, of course, that American politics is constrained by a Southern cage is extremely compelling and well documented and very valuable. But Weir itself takes this a step further, claiming that Southern politicians were primarily motivated by the desire to defend the South's distinctive racial order. Katznelson argues that Southern resistance to the inclusion of maids and farm laborers in the Social Security Act and in the protections provided by the Wagner Act were an attempt to protect Southern racial arrangements, an argument also familiar from when affirmative action was white. He argues that regional exceptions to the Fair Labor Standards Act demonstrated the dangers the New Deal faced when it dared stray beyond the tolerance to the white South. He interprets Southern resistance to the establishment of the U.S. Employment Service as a result of apprehension about the implications of the federal government over labor policy for race relations. So, more generally, he suggests that Southern representatives were able to confine policies about capitalism and labor to the limited options consistent with their racial prejudices. But I think this set of claims can be queried on two different levels. First, in terms of its understanding of the American South and its distinctiveness, and secondly, in terms of its understanding of the New Deal. Now, the claim that the American South was and is distinctively racist is a pretty common one, I would say. But it is actually quite questionable. Du Bois, of course, was famously skeptical about the idea, as Katznelson himself points out, remarking in Black North that the Negro problem is not the sole property of the South. Further, of course, as C. Van Woodward pointed out in Strange Career of Jim Crow, residential segregation and political disenfranchisement, perhaps the central features of Jim Crow, were developed first in the cities of the North in the Jacksonian period and did not characterize the South until well after the end of Reconstruction. Even lynching was far from a peculiarly Southern practice, as Katznelson's own evidence shows. Over 700 lynchings took place outside the South in the period between 1900 and 1930. Indeed, a recent study by two British scholars shows that the probability of being lynched was higher in Wyoming, Oregon, and New Mexico than in any of the states of the former Confederacy between 1889 and 1918. So this raises an issue about what we mean by the racial distinctiveness of the South. Of course, one of the things that was distinctive about the South was not just its racial constitution, but its agricultural structure. After the Civil War, sharecropping for cash crops such as cotton and tobacco dominates the American South. And in the 1890s, that system had come under threat from a class-based revolt from below, populism, which created an alliance across racial lines, and the Jim Crow system emerged to a certain extent precisely as a reaction to that threat. As legislation aimed at splitting and weakening populism, it was aimed almost as much against poor whites as against blacks, and in fact it is possible, as Katznelson himself points out, that poll taxes kept more poor whites from voting in the South than it did blacks. Now that history turns out, I think, to be highly relevant for understanding the threat that Katznelson invokes. For as a careful reading of the evidence presented in Weir itself makes clear, labor control, rather than a distinctive racial preference, was absolutely central to all the sort of concern about the Southern legislators were bringing up about the New Deal. Sorry?
3 minutes.
Okay, so finally, just want to briefly suggest that if we think about these things, it may be that the threat or the fear that is a bit occluded here is the one to, not so much to the racial order and democracy, but to property. So geopolitical and domestic threats to the interest of large proprietors would seem to be very high up on the list of the things that drove the New Deal. Katznelson, of course, recognizes that saving capital was one of the major self-imposed tasks of the New Deal, but he seems, in my view, to underestimate how central that imperative was. In some ways, this is clearest in the geopolitical realm. What's most striking about the US's geopolitical stance over the whole period from 33 to 53 is the consistency with which its foreign policy subordinated all other concerns to those of securing the international interest of the American dominant class in both its agrarian and industrial wings. Intervention in the European conflict shows this with great clarity. As Katznelson himself documents, the Southern-led interventionist bloc only emerged in 38 and 39 as Hitler's domination of the European continent began to threaten South's tobacco and cotton markets, above all in Czechoslovakia. What appears not to have elicited any interest, to state the point again, was the defense of democracy as such. Collapse of Spain, invasion and rape of Ethiopia elicited little reaction in Washington. The alliance with the Soviet Union also fits very much with this same general pattern. It was clearly a temporary expedient made in the full knowledge that it would consign the eastern half of the continent to Stalinism. Katznelson suggests that this was done to ensure a future for Western democracies. But this is somewhat hard to credit. One of the first operations of the newly established CIA was, of course, to subvert Italy's first democratic election, 1948. So after the war, the US in any case quickly pivots back to a hard anti-Soviet position, which had been a mainstay of its foreign policy through the 20s. The USSR, as is well known, wanted a Finnish solution to the question of the post-war settlement, the key question being the German question, a unified but neutral state in the middle of Europe. But the US insisted instead on breaking the country apart, setting off the Cold War, arguably in that sense actively abetting the Stalinization of Eastern Europe. None of that seems to me to demonstrate a foreign policy predominantly shaped by the aim of defending democracy, although it should be stated that liberal democratic regimes were always to be preferred when their behavior was compatible with American capital's economic interests. An analogous set of observations can be made about domestic politics. The fear that marked the New Deal years domestically was very much the fear of the entire American dominant class of a renewed populist alliance, this time strengthened by a more combative and mature industrial proletariat than existed in the 1890s. With the CIO's organizing drive to the South in 1946, Operation Dixie, that became a real and present danger. This, I would say, rather than the bogeymen of Huey Long and George Wallace, was the real threat that the Roosevelt administration confronted.
Spoken like a true student of Ira Katznelson. Okay, Loic.
You've got to be cheeky to do a working class formation on Ira Katznelson. I'm going to do a double take on race on Ira. I want to start with a note of personal appreciation. In 1982, I was an exchange student making the difficult transition from industrial economics to sociology. I was at UNC Chapel Hill and I went to a yard sale and I bought a book for $1. That book was entitled City Trenches, Urban Politics, and the Foreign Class. That's cheap intellectual drug that got me hooked onto the work of Ira Katznelson. So after reading that work, I decided I'd go study sociology at the University of Chicago. I would go for an intellectual trio, Ira, Theda, and Bill. When I got there, Ira and Theda Scotchpole were long gone. I was lucky enough to work closely with Bill Wilson, and I've been chasing Ira ever since. So it's taken me 30 years, finally got him cornered. All of this states a special honor and a distinctive pleasure to be asked to contribute to this collective appraisal of theory itself, which cannot but, even in an oblique way, be a celebration of the many-sided contributions that Ira has made to social science. The mark of a great book is that it stimulates you to think differently and to make connections that you didn't make before, and I think by that standard, this is a great book. Now, I evoke City Trenches because to me it exemplifies a distinctive formula behind Ira Katznelson's book that I've read, the 6 that I've read. First, you have a long historical perspective. Second, you have sharp social theory. Typically in City Trenches nourished by cultural Marxism, Gramsci, E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams, the dose of Engels, which is rare. Engels is one of the most undervalued social theorist, and I think you're one of the rare people who has mined his work to great effect, and a bit of Perry Anderson. And then thirdly, a painstaking empirical analysis of a pivotal case. Always, you select a signal juncture, an emblematic struggle, what Francis Bacon called an experimentum crucis, to make a point. Now, fear itself is which is in many ways a synthesis and a combination of the themes that Ira Katznelson has labored in his previous books, is quite different, that form. It is first spatially expansive, because it extends not only from the US, but to cover the entire globe. But it is temporally very narrow, covering 2 decades, 1932 to 1953. It takes these 2 decades in US policymaking and state building as its crucial experiment. But it provides no outside vantage point from which it could be compared. There's a recentering of the US and a reprovincializing of the world. And then, third point, surprisingly to me, it is almost barren of social theory. Marx, 1 side. Weber, 2 sides. Engels, 0 sides. Gramsci, 0. And more surprisingly still, Karl Polanyi, 1 decorative citation. Now, all of this to say, it's Ira Katznelson, the historian, who dominates and has almost silenced Ira Katznelson, the social theorist or the social scientist. One gets a sense this is the book that Ira wanted to write all of his life, ever since, I can imagine, a high school brainiac wanting to write the great book of history, and this is the book. So we get a book of narrative, top-down, politically driven history, built largely on the views of cabinet members, congressmen, and I stress men here, state officials, columnists, leading intellectuals, essentially highbrow operators in the field of power. It's definitely a work of political history and not social history. And here lies the paradox. There's a tension, if not a hiatus, between the central claim of the book, and which is a claim of social history, and the narrative empirical material that support it. Because the core thesis is definitely a grand sociological thesis that calls for an engagement with classical social theory. Indeed, one can read fear itself as a neo-Weberian account of the peculiarity of the US as a national state and as a global power in the 20th century, and savior of liberal democracy. Or one can read it as an American variant of Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation, a book that tackled the exact same nest of issues on the other side of the Atlantic over a longer period. Now, the central argument has 2 elements. Thesis 1, I'll call it, the New Deal was an epochal transformation. Thesis 2, it was a Faustian bargain. So let me address each of these issues, raise one question, and then pick up the Faustian bargain argument about race, and then invite you to carry it further. I'm going to propose 2 extensions. Thesis 1, the New Deal was an epochal transformation, not just for the US, but for the entire world, on a par with the French Revolution. It saved liberalism, secured democracy, preserved world peace. It fueled the construction of a distinctive kind of state in which we must seek the origins of our time. This is the subtitle. Foucault would have said, this is a history of the present. To grasp its full significance, to elevate it to that analytical level, Katznelson argued we must make these 3 shifts. Unite the domestic and the international front, bring to the fore the role of Congress rather than the role of the executive, and then focus on the pivotal and noxious role of the South, that is the imperative of maintaining white supremacy in the form of Confederate states that imposed itself on state-making during that period. So when you hear this, you would think, like, there's going to be an engagement with Barrington Moore's Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. There's going to be an engagement with Rainer Bendix, with Karl Polanyi, or Michael Mann, particularly the 3rd volume of his Source of the Social Power. These would be the recommended Sherpas on this journey, or perhaps Gramsci, analysts of the passive revolution. And certainly you would engage recent theories of the state, but instead Ira chooses the odd combination, page 11, of Alexis de Tocqueville and Bernard Bailyn. And indeed, it's the Tocqueville of the Ancien Régime and the Revolution, and not the Tocqueville of the 1847 report on Algeria, Tocqueville, the advocate of brutal colonial domination and racial extermination, which might have been quite opposite to discuss your racial cage argument, in the sense that
Still Golden Glove.
there's a Tocqueville that should have been brought in that racial cage argument. So my question,
Yes.
Why this choice to erase social theory and to ignore the comparative historical sociology is most relevant to your query and your thesis? And in a sense, it's not a rhetorical question, because here is the cost. I think the cost is a lack of clarity as to the relationship of your argument with other classic arguments about democracy and dictatorship. I think it weakens the claim about the distinctiveness of the formation of a new national state, the dual state, in part because during the same period you have a revamping of other states, and certainly the Western states, Western European states, are also colonial powers that have to deal with this, that are in the sense that have the same crusading aspect and have already built this administrative machinery that the US is building during that period. You also write, for instance, that this state had a reach, this crusading state has a reach that exceeded any prior national state or empire. And to me leads the question, did it exceed the reach of the Nazi state? A crusading state that has not only remade its own society according to a racial hierarchy, but has the ambition of capturing the totality of the world and to subject it to its rule. So I think that the claim that of what is distinctive about US, and so it weakens, it makes it an underwhelming case that what is distinctive about the US state is the power of Congress and the unique role in Congress of the Southerners, the legislature's main gatekeepers. It's difficult to assess that in the absence of a broader analytic characterization of the state and a broader comparative discussion. So in the end I find it, and let me just list a few features of the US state that is being built during that period that I think would be much more salient than the centrality of Congress and the lock that Southern congressmen have on policy making. I would think that the extreme administrative fragmentation and the lack of administrative capacity, even after the New Deal, would be a highly distinctive property of the US state. The class and racial skewing of programs, the rise of the hidden welfare state of Christopher Howard or the submerged state of Susan Mettler, such that citizens get plenty of goodies from the state, but they don't even know that they get it from the state. The absence of tradition of civil service, the deep penetration of the state by economic and financial interest, the long-standing reliance of hybrid private-public system of delivery, as argued by Jacob Hacker, or the centrality and enormous power of the court, and particularly the Supreme Court, its capacity to disregard and even overturn popular and congressional will, as we saw in the decision to stop the Florida presidential recount in 2000, or the recent modification of Obamacare. I think these are at least as salient, as important, and absent a broader comparison with other states, a broader discussion of state theory, the case is underwhelming. So I am puzzled by this lack of engagement with state theory, since Ira was one of the initiators of the State and Social Structures Committee of the Social Science Research Council that he now presides over. And this committee led to the bringing the state back in volume that regenerated the sociology of the state in the mid-80s. So I think there's a danger that the book will be actually shelved away by many political sociologists as, in a sense, another narrative history of the New Deal that need not concern analytic social scientists. So likely it could be remedied. I think a 15-page appendix in the paperback edition will be fabulous edition. Now I come to thesis 2, the Foston bargain. The success of the New Deal, Katznelson tells us, came at a steep cost. Its accommodation of and association with totalitarianism on the foreign front, Mussolini's fascism, Soviet Stalinism, and racism on the domestic front. Here's the language that he uses. Costly illiberal alliances, necessary evil and dirty hands, an arrangement, intimate partnership with white supremacy, or the willful amnesia of race, because to push his program forth, FDR needed Congress, and in Congress, essentially Southern congressmen held veto power over legislation. Now, I would mention that the British and the French state had to deal at their own Foston bargains to deal with after World War II, and I need only mention the mass massacres of natives in Madagascar, still not recognized by the French state 60 years later, that I think would provide an interesting comparison point. And in some ways, they had a much more Faustian bargain to deal with. But let me concentrate on the Southern cage thesis. The New Deal tolerated and abetted the organized racial cruelty of the Jim Crow South by omission and by commission, because Southern congressmen were the pivotal bloc, and were able to, quote, impose their will on each facet of the New Deal. Now I want to push Ira Katznelson to go further on both of these theses and to propose two extensions. Extension number one.
You've got 5 minutes.
Okay. Ira places special and often determining role on the Jim Crow front and center, but I think it does not go far enough here. First, the national state provided active support to racial inequality prior to the New Deal, as shown by Desmond King in his book Separate and Equal. But more importantly, it didn't support just the southern racial cage of Jim Crow. It also built the northern cage of the second ghetto. The ghetto was remade, the urban ghetto, this is the connection to Black Metropolis, the remaking of the Black Metropolis from above as a spatial contraption for ethno-racial closure and control in the South is the missing role of the New Deal. Indeed, the New Deal built infrastructure, the construction, the public housing, welfare support, political access, essentially helped build the second ghetto of the mid-century. And there's a linkage between the second and the first ghetto, and I'll deal here, I'll feel. So the New Deal not only built the southern cage of Jim Crow, but also helped build the northern cage of the urban ghetto as this spatial contraption to contain and close African Americans, the northern cage of the ghetto. But precisely because it made the southern cage so insufferable, it helped promote the great black migration. So this is population shifts, which were attracted to the ghetto, and the ghetto was a magnet precisely because it was built not only as a cage, but also as a cocoon, as very well described in the work of the 60s. And so this helped strengthen the ghetto was the instrument for the accumulation of economic capital, social capital, cultural capital of the black community, which fueled the NAACP, the Urban League, which fueled the civil rights movement. And in fact, in the book, you mentioned that the only 3 or 4% of the black electorate nationwide was pivotal for the election. And this is what created this tension for FDR. He needed this. Why did he have this 3%? Because blacks were compacted inside of the northern cage that the state helped build. So the building of the second ghetto, this is Arnold Hirsch, this is an element, is a product of the New Deal. But here's then the contradiction. The New Deal also fueled the white migration. And the great white migration is a forgotten story of the transformation of the South. This is this great book by James Gregory, which transformed completely your vision of America, because the great black migration not only became opposed to the civil rights movement, but diffused and then came to foster, in my diagram, I have to fill in the blanks, in my own diagram, this leads to the collapse of the ghetto, and the collapse of the ghetto and the collapse of the coalition, the New Deal coalition, which was in particular fueled by the diffusion of whites from the South, which transported everywhere around the country their politics of race, of taxes, of crime, of welfare. This led to the collapse of the coalition, which led to the racial reaction. This is the double reaction of the 1970s, the racial reaction and the class reaction. Now, the great T. Wright Mills, in his book, Listen Yankee, writes, and
2 minutes.
I hope you listen, Yankee. As its counter-revolution, that is the sign that the revolution is for real. And every revolution must defend itself against its counter-revolution, or the revolution will fail. So if we take your argument seriously that the New Deal was a revolution on the par with the French Revolution, then we must extend our analysis to encompass the third American Republic that was built after the one we live in, that was built after the 70s, characterized by rising inequality, rampant social insecurity, the centrality of welfare, crime, taxes as electoral issues, the re-engineering of the state to the benefits of the holders of economic and cultural capital, and the policies that castigate the dependent sub-proletariat with the rise of restrictive workfare and expensive prison fare. In a sense, if we expand your temporal horizon, and we take not only the revolution, but the counter-revolution that is part of the same chain of historical events, then we get a very different vision of that dual state. This is a dual state which has brought punitive workfare and prison fare, a state built in reaction to the achievements of labor and the advances of the civil rights movement. We need then to bring to the fourth secure institution of racialized hyperincarceration as one of the costs, the hidden costs of the New Deal. So the book shouldn't end in January 1953, but it should end around 1994, in the period 1994-1998, when you have a cluster of laws that solidify the disciplinary hold of the centaur state that practices liberalism at the top and punitive authoritarianism at the bottom. Three pieces of legislation: the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. It's preceded in 1994 by the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, the single biggest and most costly criminal justice piece of legislation in world history. It's followed in 1997 by the No Frills Prison Act, which massively expanded funding for states that reduced possessions, services, and healthcare to convicts, and by the 1998 Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act that essentially dismantled public housing in the United States, as exemplified in the title by Edward Gertz, The Ruins of the New Deal, Race, Economic Justice, and Public Housing. So, as a coda, conclusion.
1 minute.
In his memoirs, Tocqueville warned, in a revolution, as in a novel, the most difficult part is to invent the end. It means that, just like at a restaurant, you don't assess a meal until you've been presented the bill. You can't assess a revolution without putting in the balance the counter-revolution it typically provokes. If we include the second racial cage and the neoliberal counter-revolution of 1972-2012 as part of the legacy of the great transformation ushered by the New Deal, if we take the view from below, the view of Americans shorn of economic and cultural capital, that is, if we bring social history back into your overly political history from above, if we detect what kind of state was built on the ruins of the New Deal, a centaur state that practices liberal paternalism, then we can both push the model further than you do in time, and I think analytically as well, and also we come to a less sanguine conclusion than the one that Ira Katznelson reaches about the legacy of the New Deal. The Third American Republic looks less like what is called in the book on page 475 a rejuvenating triumph, and more like a slow motion defiling of the very democratic rights that the New Deal was supposed to secure.
All you have to do is write a 15-page preface in the second volume. Margaret, what have you got in store?
Okay, well, this is the penance for having the last W-E-I-R, it's W-W-A.
For once, I'm not
Alphabetical order.
So let me start also thanking Michael for putting this together. And I went to the University of Chicago 35 years ago because I wanted to study with Ira Katznelson. And my dream came true.
One the failed dream, and the American dream, and the French failure.
So I just want to say, I started learning from Ira long ago, and I have learned from him these many years, and so it's a great honor to comment on this book that I have heard pieces of throughout a long period of time. So I'm going to start with a few comments about what I think the book does to reframe our thinking, or reframe what we think about American history in this period. And then I want to focus more on the Southern cage, the argument about the South and the New Deal, and then a few things towards the end about the subtitle, The Origins of Our Time. So let me just say the thing, I appreciate the historical approach in this book and the way that it makes a case about what was at stake in the New Deal. And the historical approach emphasizes the uncertainty that the actors felt about whether authoritarianism was the way that the United States should go. So it makes very real the sense that there was an option for the United States to go in an authoritarian direction, and that was something that was being worked out in the course of this history. And I think the historical narrative really helps to make that come alive here. So that's sort of the first thing that I would highlight, and I found very distinctive because it then makes you think differently about one of the achievements of the New Deal as the preservation of democratic government. The second kind of thing is putting the domestic side of the New Deal together with the national security side. And that is something that's very rarely done in accounts of the New Deal, and really cuts into arguments about, is the American state a weak state or is it a strong state? And it highlights, it is both a kind of a weak state and a kind of a strong state. That one part, the national security part, the executive branch has lots of room for maneuver, unfettered by Congress, and a very different state when it comes to domestic policy, very fettered by Congress, and limited room for maneuver of the executive branch. And I couldn't help but think, as I was reading this, about the contrast between the capabilities of the NSA and the capabilities of healthcare.gov as sort of the two sides of the American state. So let me turn to the focus on Congress and making the South the pivot. And I want to raise two issues related to making the South the pivot. And one of them is the fact of racism in the rest of the country, and the other is the strength of anti-government free market forces outside the South. So let me say a little bit about each of those points. So the first is about the fact of racism outside the South. So as I was reading this book, I also then thought of Roger Smith's book, Civic Ideals, which tracks laws limiting citizenship on the basis of race at the national level, kept state-level issues, kept Japanese from owning property in California. I also thought about our colleague Sibel Fox, her account of the New Deal, which shows how Mexican immigrants were treated differently from white immigrants, targeted for deportation and unassimilable by social workers. And I also noted that in your account, you treat the discussion of Japanese internment as part of a decision made by the national security state, and that its connections with broader patterns of racism are not the focus. So I do think that there are ways in which the book underplays the strength of racial animus in other parts of the country in order to make its points about the South. But ultimately, I think that you're right to stress the distinctive political significance of Southern racial segregation. And that is because its pervasiveness in all Southern institutions blocked the emergence of alternative voices in the South, and crucially the development of organized labor in the South. And then when you put that together with the South's power in national politics, it means we leave this period devoid of stronger national institutions that could have strengthened the hands of anti-racist forces in other political arenas. So the national state could have been provided more levers for anti-racist forces at the local level or at the state level, and instead they're sort of left with what you describe as this procedural state. So let me talk about the second point, which is the strength of free market and anti-government sentiment. So I was trying to think through kind of issues in the New Deal that I have questions about whether they fit your story. And it seems to me that some of the lapses in social protections stem not from the role of the South per se, but from anti-government forces more generally. And so one of them is issue of housing, and this goes to your issue about public housing. Already in 1937, the Housing Act kept public housing very, very small. And I don't know what your diagrams, and I'm sure the South was not strong in that, but it is also clear that real estate interests and building interests who did not want a strong government role were a critical part in limiting the federal role on housing, because of course, once those programs were implemented, they were all implemented in racially segregated ways. So you could have done more housing and just kept it racially segregated. And the other area is health. You know, it's not clear why the South would have objected to a stronger federal role in health. You know, you could fit it into the Southern segregated patterns, and it seems there it really is the AMA and resistance to a stronger role of the state. And even in the South, I wonder about the role of industrial interests in the South. I mean, you note that they begin to play a role, especially in the 1940s, that there are more industries in the South. It's not just the Southern agricultural interests. And I wonder, you know, do they support the Southern argument because it's anti-labor, not because it's because it's racist? So that you really, in the South, have distinct interests that support the same policies, but for different reasons. And that's, you know, the suggestion that it's race is a piece of it, but this kind of anti-statism, free market stance is also something that needs to be understood in creating the omissions in the New Deal that then become part of this hidden welfare state, because we provide them through other means afterwards. So, and then finally, I want to just turn to end with some thoughts about the origins of our time. So, the book says that what we end up with at the national level is what he calls a procedural state, and it's a state that is kind of like David Truman's parallelogram of interests. Sorry about that, you sociologists. That's a political science thing, but that there's no room for a public interest. Did you have to read that? No, sorry.
The famous parallelogram.
Yeah.
We all have our boxes.
So, I don't know. I think there's more here to say about the nature of the state and the nature of the interests that we leave this period with. And so on the nature of the state, it seems to me that the state, the American state, is more than the federal government. Great diversity across the American states, and not just South versus other places. And that the inability of the national state, the federal government, to penetrate into those places, or to be able to provide levers for the liberal forces to strengthen themselves within those places, really ultimately limited the ability of liberalism to build a liberalism across the states. So that it's not just a procedural state, but it's perhaps a procedural state layered on top of these, you know, very already very problematic subnational units, both at the state level and at the local level, and that federal state just didn't give any levers for reaching in there and helping to build liberalism in these other levels. And then at the same time, it allowed those places to create sort of protected venues for very different set of ideas and conservative ideas to flourish. So that, you know, in a sense, that mobilization of bias in American institutions against liberalism and progressive forces and labor is much deeper than just the notion of a procedural state would suggest. And then one last thing I want to say is, it seems to me also that the impact of the limited success of the New Deal is not just the, you know, which interests are strong and which interests are weak, but also influences the content of those interests. And so here, for example, that American business knows it can exit to a non-union environment within the country makes American business think very differently about what its interests and what its options are. And so it's not just that it's stronger at the national level, but it actually perceives the range of its range of possibility in much different ways than it otherwise would. And then on the side of unions, with industrial unions weakest, the most anti-racist unions weakened through your story, that the kind of business unionism is much stronger coming out of this time period, which made unions so ill-prepared to deal with the 1970s and the 1980s. So in a way I have a similar kind of taking the story, but a different focus than Loic does about what it is that the New Deal left us, how it left us weakened and leading unable to challenge the rise of conservative interests. But I'll stop, but I say this is really long, but it's really
It's beautifully written.
it is so fun to read and such a pleasure to read that well, I'm a Ira student, so I just really want to say that you know it really does make you think about American politics in a different way, and it's quite an achievement. So I guess that won't make you cry.
It's not over yet.
Okay, so 10 minutes?
10 minutes. I'm laughing because my watch reads 11:30. So first of all, thanks. I mean, not just perfunctory thanks. This is the single best. I've been involved in many discussions of this book since it was published in spring. This is the best, sharpest, and I mean it both in terms of the incisiveness of the questions raised, the fundamental quality of some of the challenges, and the thoughtfulness of each of the three critiques. And they are serious critiques. 10 minutes will not do justice to them. So let me caricature a bit. In part because I think some of the things I said were slightly caricatured too. Let me just start with the issue with Loic and the question of where's social theory? And here I actually made, I believe, absolutely free to disagree, that there's as much social theory in this book as anything I've ever written, but it's latent. It's the scaffolding. The very subtitle, "The Origins of Our Time," is a play on Polanyi's subtitle, which has the origins of our time in the title. And I think of this primarily as a riff, as it were, on the Polanyi claim, which I do quote and not decoratively, that in this period of the 30s and 40s, there were only three choices. Socialism, by which he meant Bolshevism, fascism, and the New Deal. He didn't say liberalism. He said, and the New Deal. That in the great crisis that he portrays, it was only the New Deal that was available. And that to me was a central challenge, to understand why and how it was that this very complex formation had the standing that equivalent to that of what Tocqueville said some 70-odd years later about the French Revolution, and where Tocqueville had said we are in absolutely the right place to assess something. It's long enough ago that we have a long perspective, but the passions are still felt, and we're still living with the direct outcomes. It's quite right that the book does not, it does stop in 1952. It suggests in the postscript that both sides of what I call the, for want of a better label, the procedural and crusading state, contain both enormous gains and deep pathologies, and that the pathologies are inherent in the gains. This is your point, I mean, as well, but it wasn't the book that then says what happens in 1967, or let alone the Crime Act, or and so on. But this is a book about state theory, and it's a book that is both bringing the state back in, it's one of the things Dylan said it, and maybe you said it, it's not social history as much as political history, but it's state-centered political history, but a state that is a liberal state in the sense that political representation and Congress is as much at its core as the bureaucracy that Theda and others, and I, as part of that group at one point, emphasized, or as the court, or as the presidency itself. And I remain stunned, just as a scholar, by how little political historians ever write about Congress. You can read the thousands of volumes on the New Deal, and you find Congress is just a site where a law gets passed but without any analysis, and political scientists typically write about Congress as raw material for model building, about strategies, about information, but without the substance built in. So if there's one, not explicitly stated, it's written as a trade book in the hope of and you also think about how your audiences are. But it is a book about state theory. And it, I hope, does what you said so flatteringly, excessively so, that you said I always try to choose empirical cases that are pivotal. For me, this period is pivotal, precisely not only where it stands in a long historical strand, but because of the way it illuminates fundamental issues about liberal theory and state theory. So that's just my own reaction to that. But you're quite right. What is not there is an explicit engagement, as you put it, with Bendix, Mann, Barrington Moore, and so on. It is, if you like, at least some of it is implicitly there, but motivated largely by theory of the state. Dylan, I'm out of time already?
Five.
Okay.
Halfway through it.
Well, I'll stretch an extra 2 or 3.
I'll bell here.
I get an extra 30 seconds for that. Time wasting. My very shorthand version of Dylan's really superb critique, all three superb, was in effect, where's the political economy? How do you know that it's racism or race that's motivating the South rather than labor relations or so on and so forth? Well, it is at least, and I'll come back to the argument about what the danger was or not in liberal democracy, but I'm starting with the Southern racial order. I'll answer at 2 or 3 different levels, just because we have no time. First is to say that I actually think it's not possible to simply separate out the race and the political economy in this period, as if there's a lexical, as if there's an order. And what I hoped I was saying was that the pivot for the South, the moment when they stop being 100% New Dealers, comes precisely with the growth of the labor challenge in the South. But, and here's my big but, when you read, as for better or worse I did, every page of the congressional record that debates these questions about shifting U.S. employment service to the states, about labor law, not just Taft-Hartley, but the Case Bill and other bills. Every time you read it, the Southern members, and not just the most reactionary ones or the racist ones, Lyndon Johnson talked about it in terms of the need to protect the autonomy of the South and Southern race relations. There was not one Southern member of Congress in this period, including the most liberal, like Claude Pepper, who wanted a more progressive political economy, who ever opposed racial segregation. Indeed, Pepper made a speech in 1948 explaining how Harry Truman really supported racial segregation to win votes in the South. In the lexical order, race always came first, but it was imbricated with political economy. So I don't accept your revisionist suggestion. And I don't quite, I slightly more accept the idea that, well, it's true, I cited my own evidence, that, so I can't deny it, what I came to call in shorthand the crusading state is not a simple matter. So the affair of American elites with Balbo and Mussolini was of course not a celebration of democracy, but it was a defense of democracy, explicitly so, because he was seen as the least bad alternative as compared to Hitler. And it was in the context of Hitlerism that FDR thought we can learn things from Mussolini, corporatism, for example. And then people like Tugwell said what we learn has to be conditioned by liberal democracy. So there are endless essays in the early 30s, liberal corporatism, democratic planning from the Stalin model. Now, what was the threat? I don't think I ever said, if I did, I misspoke, but you will not find me saying that American liberal democracy was about to collapse into dictatorship, that was the problem. And I explicitly say in a number of paragraphs that no one thought the United States was about to become Stalinist or Hitlerite or the like. But what many people thought, including Roosevelt, including Lippmann, which are the two I quoted, was that unless serious modifications were made to the procedures of liberal democracy, the big problems of the era, including confronting the most important two dictatorships, first the Hitler one, and then after the war, especially the Stalin one, simply would fail. And the Congress is at the center precisely because that's where the critique was made. And if that's where the critique was, that's where the solution also was found, and that's what's been missing. Last, I'll say something fairly general. Well, one thing I'm just something I want to say to my dear friend Margaret. You can just imagine what it's like to write a book together, which we had a very good experience doing. The racism in the rest of the country, it's raised by both Loic and Margaret. This is a book not about the character of American racism, which in many times I say in the book was truly national. But politically, it's the point. You underscored, and I would underscore it even more. In the hierarchy of decisions and preferences taken in Washington, in the 30s and 40s, the Northern Democrats and Northern Republicans did not place race at the top of their list. They were indifferent to the plight of blacks, and at best, and many were racist. Some were not. There also were Northern liberals who were appalled by lynching and all the rest. But it was only the South, that's Southerners, and this is the political science point, if you like, who had the capacity and the power in the legislature, given their profound advantages of a one-party system, seniority, low turnout, voting system, to not just control the politics of the South, but essentially to control the policy-making politics of the United States. And depending on where they landed in their preferences, that's the lawmaking that happened. When they wanted the Wagner Act to empower the CIO, with farm workers and maids left out, they got it. And when they wanted Taft-Hartley with the Republicans, they got it. You cannot find a piece of legislation in the 30s and 40s that passed against the will of the South, and after 1938, when Southern segregationists composed the majority of the majority party, or the majority of the minority party in 1946 to 48, 47, 48, it was Southern preferences that determined the outcome in Washington. So the first ghetto, the second ghetto, the third ghetto, all of this stuff doesn't simply have its roots here, but shaped decisively by the South. Just final 2 points, and then I'll be quiet. We're all model builders. That is to say, this this book is written more in its style like traditional history than some other things I've written, but it in effect is a profound, willful simplification. I don't mean profound as good, but just a profound simplification of an immensely complex social reality. There are many things left out here. Franklin Roosevelt hardly appears in this book. Can you really write about the New Deal without FDR? It's a willful decision to do what we always do as social scientists. What you do when you write about prisons, what you do in this wonderful work about civil society and fascism, what you do about federalism and race, Margaret, is to select a particular feature of social relations and causal connections, because you wager that by betting on those, you actually can illuminate larger topics. That's my wager. It may or may not have worked, but the complaints about what's not there that's a self-conscious decision. To create a book which is written as analytical history, a kind of model building that at once remains true to the archival and other sources as history, but which is not traditional political history, and it's not traditional political science either, but some kind of hybrid.
It's sociology!
That's where the tears come in. Now you can cry.
As my former brother-in-law, Bob Browner of this department, once said to me, anything is sociology.
Especially around here.
And you can demonstrate the truth of that on a daily basis. But the very last thing about origins of our time, and I will stop. Of course, things that happen later have a connection to this history I told. But I would be very careful, especially this is a comment to Loic, but others have made the same point, Margaret did as well, about what happens later. I don't think you can simply say that the central causal feature of the carceral state that was created in our time, that has imprisoned so many people, is the result of the New Deal? No. Some features created here, including the aspects of what I call the procedural state, and the absence of a certain kind of labor in the state, and da-da-da-da, may be thought of as part of the necessary condition. But it's just too linear a line from here to there. And if there were subsequent volumes, not to be written by me, but by others, which guys are writing, you would have to make it at least as thick as this about the contingencies and causalities and structures underway in a temporally contained period. And the very last thing I will say is that we make strategic choices in all of us do all the time, and some are better, some are worse. If the book has merit, it's related intimately to its defects, and the defects have been sharply and persuasively, many of them, not all of them, pointed out. But so a short time span allows for an intensity of focus at a pivotal moment that you would not have if it were a 100-year history. The privileging of the voices of the actors as opposed to the social theory about the voices of the actors highlights what my late colleague Chuck Tilley used to call prospective rather than retrospective history, and the notion of origins can be either tight or slacker, and here it's actually both at the same time. It's tight in saying a certain kind of state, double-sided state, was created that we still live with, but it's a big set of categories within which we can fit federalism, the core. northern race relations, etc. So I'll stop. But I found this discussion enormously stimulating, and I love its comradely tough-mindedness.
Okay, very good. So, I think I'm going to extend it by chair's privilege to 9:15, so 25 minutes, unless I see an exodus at 9 o'clock. So it would be great if other people who also have interest in this book would perhaps make some comments or questions. And perhaps we can take 2 or 3. Or perhaps there will be silence. Never happened before. Yes, perhaps you tell me who you are. It's Dick Walker. Yes, Dick Walker from Geography, wearing spectacles.
Right.
And who is leading a fantastic project on the New Deal.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems that what came out here were, I think, 3 things that are a bit under-theorized in the book. And there are probably more, but 3 key ones. One is the sort of Southern political economy, which is, you know, this is a book, a political science book, not a political economy book, as Dylan pointed out. And I think he's absolutely right. And you have a hard time in this debate, you come back to the fact you have to characterize the South ultimately as a race, class, labor system, because that's what makes it different than California, even if Californians were incredibly racist at times. And that's really important. A second one that came out through Margaret especially was sort of the theory of capital and the state and the sort of porosity of the American state to capital, especially through the federal system and so on. So I'm not going to say more about those because those have already been touched. But one thing I think wasn't said, this reminds me of my last book, which is kind of egotistical. But I like to call my last book my liberal book because it was written out of a kind of desperation when Bush was elected, I got to find something good in America. This is kind of your liberal book because you're writing it from the present day, indeed, on the origins of our time. You're looking back and saying, wow, what was it that preserved liberalism, which looks really good in our times? The kind of New Deal liberalism looks much better than we used to think it looked when we were all much more 68ers and so on. So you're kind of defending that liberalism, but I think what you don't do, I think you under-theorize liberalism. It's interesting that you use all these guys like David Truman and the kind of Robert Dahl and Lippmann and so on, and not the critics of those people. And you don't mention, I don't know if you mention Selznick, you do mention Lowy at one point, and others that are much more critical of that. But you never go back to some of the deep, think of somebody like Peter Linebaugh about the 2 faces of liberalism. The liberalism, you characterize the South as a terrorist state around race, which is true. But liberalism has always had that dark side of a kind of terror on the workers, that those who oppose the rule of property and, the big open-hearted liberalism of the upper classes are suppressed and terrorized. And that side of liberalism somehow gets left out of this.
Shall we
No,
collect?
Yes,
No, let's collect.
Yeah. I know it's probably intimidating to follow all these great speeches. Anybody, innocent question? Yes.
So I haven't read the whole book, so...
Why don't you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Laura Nelson, I'm a sociology graduate student here. I haven't read the whole book, so if you do cover this, you can talk about it. But I'm wondering about the rhetorical role of the family and protection of the family that was very strong throughout the New Deal, prior to the New Deal, but also after the New Deal, in particular to galvanize racism, so the protection of white women against the black man, but also anti-communism. So communism, they just want to take our women, they want to privatize the women, they want to disrupt the family, and how that was such a strong and largely unquestioned way that the state could kind of solidify this opposition to communism or support for racism, and this disproportionate targeting of women who were playing roles in the New Deal during the McCarthyism. So, and the way they targeted women was not that you were in a communist organization, but it's you're not a proper woman. You don't know how to cook, you don't cook for your husband, you work, what are you doing? And their support for themselves to say, no, I'm not a communist, was not to say, I'm not a communist, but look, I can cook this dish, I'm a good woman, I will take care of my man, and that's why I'm not a communist. So, this kind of pervasive and unquestioned role of kind of protection of the family throughout the New Deal, and how that was not even, the question of that was not even put on the books until the mid-1970s. So it was a very stable way that the state could kind of support it.
Yes.
Can I ask another question?
Behind it.
Yes.
You are?
Identify.
Phil Rocco from the Graduate Student in Political Science. I had a question about fear, because as I was reading your book, I thought more about the fact that the major institutions of the American state that developed after the New Deal also really developed in a climate of fear of communism. And in fact, if you read, statements made by, the president of the Chamber of Commerce or conservatives in the 1950s about the way that the American state is developing, they're saying that increasing centralization of state capacity is I think the words were the threat or the death of human freedom, right? This is the language that they're using, and it actually extends much further in time than I think we often think about when we think about American political development. And so I guess the question is, to what extent do you think fear is something that we should be studying not only in the context of what we think of as a crisis, but in periods that, as American political development scholars, just treat as stasis. We treat the 1960s and 1970s as periods of big state building, this kind of bulge of policies, the new social regulation, but we don't really think about how fear of the state is actually developing in the shadow of an international political economy.
Okay, very good. Now, you
Good.
respond to those three.
So, on your theory, I now have 20 minutes to talk.
What's
So,
my theory?
You said we had until 8:15.
We, not
I mean,
you.
You're not done yet.
Anyway, start with liberalism under-theorized. Possibly. I want to put question marks after some of the sentences. In fact, one of the implicit things, well, I'll tell you a little story. Just before, when the book was in a penultimate draft, the University of Virginia kindly hosted, an author meets critics kind of thing. I wish it would have been quite as sharp and rich as this, but one of the people commenting was David Kennedy, Pulitzer Prize historian on the New Deal, and who read it, did me a great favor of doing it. And he said, this book is just another New Left history. It's all about the failures of liberalism for the guardianship of property and capitalism. It's exactly what. And I said, no. And it's not that I wish this to be an anti, let's call it New Left. What was the New Left history of the New Deal, which focused on the protection of property, the saving of capitalism, and so on. And that's been a contestation about that, and I largely still would come out where I would have 30 years ago, on that. But I just simply wanted a different angle of vision altogether. But it doesn't negate the issues of the importance of labor, of property, and so on. I'm just not sure it always comes out first in the lexical order, as Dylan was suggesting it does, including in the foreign policy. I guess, so the way to use your question to come back to something you said, I don't think it's simply true, or it can't be just assumed that it's true, that the central motivations the United States had in opposing Hitler, for example, or in opposing Stalin for that matter, were simply economic, or protect American property, that the democracy question was just, legitimating baloney. I don't think that's true. I think they're not mutually inconsistent. And the question is how they were woven together, not the choice of one or the other. And that's the way I would come back to the liberalism issue. The implicit theorization is where I began my first remarks, which is that I think when we talk about liberalism, not as economic liberalism, but in the political tradition, it involves these transactions of state economy, state society, state and membership issues. And those are exactly the issues that are central to the analysis and were the challenge of the New Deal. On the family, if you read the whole book, you still wouldn't be satisfied, because it's not, there are occasional things mentioned. For example, you'll see, maybe you've already seen it, but when one of the great racists, it's not praised, one of the great racists in the Senate, Theodore Bilbo, spoke about lynching, or others did, they would talk about protection of the family. So the rhetoric appears from time to time in the book. But not just the family, but gender relations more broadly are not a central focus, not because they're not important, but because they're dealt with as they came directly into the story told here. And I think in retrospect, there's more I could have done, and regret that. So that's fear. What a hard question. I think there are rare moments. I'll answer it at three different levels. Fear never disappears entirely. That there are always going to be some features of social and political reality in which assessing risk, because we think we know the framework within which the risk exists, will always be problematic. That's true in the periods that we call moments of stasis or continuity or what have you. But there are some kinds of fear which persist over long periods that are quite special. And the one I actually emphasize a lot in this book, in my favorite chapter anyway, is a chapter called Wildest Hopes. And it's about atomic fear. Once we have atomic weapons, then the genie doesn't go back in the bottle. And it's even well before the Soviet Union exploded its bomb in August 1949, and well before there was a hydrogen bomb. The American public media, radio, not television yet, but radio, Life magazine, were full of materials about the threat to physical existence of humankind. And I didn't quote it, but if I can find it in a second. Dwight Eisenhower, in his inaugural address, says in January 1953, "Science seems ready to confer upon us as its final gift the power to erase human life from the planet." That dimension is now one we can never escape. It's a wonderful, fantastic new book out about India and Pakistan and their atomic weapons, which on the whole in Pakistan are not clearly atomic weapons under control. Or this recent big new book published about how many hundreds, if not thousands, of accidents there have been in American atomic policy since the war. This is a fear generated in this period that is part of the origin of our time. It will, if we're lucky, it will never go away, and if it's unlucky, we'll never know, because but then you have some moments, and the New Deal was one, and the New Deal of the 20-year period I deal with, where there was a layering of sources of fear, that is, situations that seemed and were unique. The collapse of capitalism was so profound, there was no policy universe that could be just plucked and said, well, we solved the problem 10 years ago like this, or the last depression just like that. You had to invent things from scratch. Some good, some bad. These new dictatorships in Moscow, in Berlin, and before that in Rome, were completely new as authoritarian regimes. They had a mass base, they had party systems, they generated real fear. And I think, Dylan, you underestimated it. Not that the United States would become just like them, but in an era where 22 constitutional democracies ended after Versailles and before the Second World War, the United States felt itself to be, and its elites felt themselves to be, increasingly hemmed in, hedged in, and part of a regime structure that had lost its capacities as opposed to the others. And we could go on about violence and atomic weapons and the Cold War and the Soviet Union and all the rest. So there was a layering of sources of fear, and when those moments happened, they posed particular challenges. The very last thing I'll say about this is to remind ourselves that what I came to call the state that had no procedural constraints was born, I believe, of course this World War I has these features, there was surveillance and all kinds of stuff, but the durable national security state of that kind started in the mid-1930s when when the challenge of Hitler caused Roosevelt to order the FBI to begin surveillance of mail and telephone conversations of American citizens. And Hoover, no great civil libertarian, turned to Roosevelt and says, "You can't do that, Mr. President. The Supreme Court ruled in 1934 that this kind of surveillance is unconstitutional." And Roosevelt, already privately scripted, calls in Secretary of State Cordell Hull and has Hull say, "Mr. President, I'm asking you as Commander-in-Chief to order surveillance of American citizens because of the global threat of dictatorship in Nazi Germany." And Roosevelt turns to Hoover and says, "I order you as Commander-in-Chief." Or 1939 and 1941, how many of us remember, I didn't know till I did some research, that Franklin Roosevelt declared what was called a limited state of emergency in 1939. And in 1941, we were not at war, declared a state of emergency. There is no constitutional warrant for a president to declare a state of emergency. Congress did not vote for a state of emergency. And the declaration of the state of emergency gave to the president absolute power to move labor, capital, anywhere he wanted, and to mobilize, without any legislative authority, the American people to fight the emergency. This was not a war yet. So we're looking at a very complicated picture, and it was only my Southerners that really loved this stuff in this period, in part for reasons of political economy. Their trade was threatened by the autarky, in part for reasons of ethnic solidarity with Great Britain, and in part because they were deeply embedded ideologically and practically in the world of the American military, and had a global perspective that was distinct regionally. And I will stop with this story. It's the last story. May I tell it? It's the single most important vote in Congress in the 20th century. How's that?
That'd be a good story.
And then I will stop. You say you have chair's privilege. I got some privilege.
No, you don't.
I'm going to proceed.
You're from New York.
I'm going to proceed nonetheless. In 1940, the United States passed a peacetime draft, but it was hedged by the rule that soldiers could never move outside the Western Hemisphere, and that it would last for only 1 year. It's the only way Roosevelt could get it through. A year later, 1941, in the summer of 41, Roosevelt says, "I look around the world, we need an army. We need to extend the peacetime draft longer than a year and without the restriction of the Western Hemisphere only." And there's a vote taken in the U.S. House of Representatives in July 1941, that's 5 months before Pearl Harbor, 203 to 202, it passes in the House. Shift of one vote would have meant that at Pearl Harbor, the United States would have had an armed force smaller than Belgium's, which would have meant it would have taken at least a year or two, 2 years probably, to ramp up any kind of military, Navy or Army, capable of confronting the emergency of war. Who voted for that? Republicans all voted no, almost all voted no, on the argument that a peacetime draft is a threat to liberty. There's a point to that. It's not, it was a good liberal argument about standing armies against standing armies and against conscription. Northern Democrats were split in half because those that had German, Italian, and Irish constituencies voted no. And you could see why. And only because a completely united Southern bloc voted yes did the United States have any kind of military at Pearl Harbor. So we're full of ironies like this, in which the rescue, if you like, not abstract rescue of democracy against dictatorship, but the actual practical military rescue was conditioned on the support of by far the least liberal, organized, lawfully illiberal part of the American polity.
Whoa, yes, Mara, very good.
Hi, Mara.
So I want to pick up actually your answer to the last question about that question I have about you argue that the nature of the state that emerged in this period, one part of it began its ways is this procedural state, this dense procedural, and that the legitimacy comes not from the substantive interest itself, but from the following of democratic procedure, different aspects of procedural. But then, so basically in a nutshell, my question is it really true? Is this an apt characterization? Because your own response to this question with Hoover and how you get around the problem of a Supreme Court ruling that says you can't do this is you bring in this guy and you say, I need you to order me to do this. And so it seems to me it's really a state in which the appearance of procedural, of certain following certain procedures is paramount, but that's very different from a state in which that is actually characterized in its functioning and its workings
Procedural
by
outside of national security, once labeled national security.
But what gets labeled as
procedures.
that is also increasing.
It's interesting, I'm interrupting, but you mentioned C. Wright Mills. Wright Mills's book, The Power Elite, made the argument that on peak decisions, you really have an elite, not Congress. You would think it's a complete contradiction of what I've said in my book, but no, because all his examples, every single one of his examples was a national security example, beginning with dropping a bomb on Hiroshima. And that, he says, doesn't require Congress or any democratic procedures. And he was absolutely right about that. And ironically, Robert Dahl, who wrote one of the most scathing critiques of Mill's book, had written an article in 1953, just 6 pages long, in which he said, it was about atomic energy. And he said, we now have substantive issues in American polity that have pushed the polity outside of the ken of democracy altogether. And that's never going to change given the nature of those policies. If anything, that scope may grow. And if you think about NSA or Guantanamo or a whole set of other kinds of stuff like that, that side of what I call the crusading state, leaving aside whatever the motivation was, the rhetoric is at least the crusading rhetoric, continued. So it's...
Are there any questions from you?
Then they get the last.
I just want to piggyback and ask you a clarification here. Is your claim that the U.S., the building of the state that comes out of the New Deal is distinctive for its procedural side, or that it is like every other liberal, democratic, bureaucratic state? Because I'm sure that Germany...
No, because that's the question.
Answer, not unique, but let's just stick to post-war Europe. The liberal democratic states created in post-war Europe with a deep procedural side would not have happened if not for the American New Deal. They were shaped by the model of the New Deal, and I would say that, just as a shorthand, what came to be called European social democracy after the war was the left wing of the New Deal, and not anything like pre-war, older European social democracy.
A counterexample.
No, not counterexample. Absolutely
We can talk
not.
about later.
Last question. Yes.
Hi, first, thank you for the book.
Identify yourself.
My question.
Identify yourself.
Oh, my name is David Stein. I'm a PhD student in American Studies and Ethnic Studies.
It's hard to keep.
My question has to do with the relationship between fiscal policy and monetary policy, and the role of sort of the Federal Reserve wresting itself free from the procedural state in 1951, and how that figures in some of these things. And I'm thinking about it partly in relationship to Margaret's work on politics and jobs and full employment.
Margaret, answer that question. She knows a hell of a lot more about this than I. You know, this distinction between procedural and crusading or whatever, or insulated state, is like any too present in a way, because there are parts of the quote procedural side which are even designed to be insulated. That includes the reserve, it includes the courts, it includes some regulatory bodies. And some of the most interesting questions we have is to what extent they really are insulated, when they are, and under what conditions. This is a question Ted Loic asked years ago in his book, The End of Liberalism, and where other critics have asked the question. But that this, quote, procedural state is not just transparent, open, and so on. But these institutions, and the same is true of the crusading national security institutions, were created through the democratic process. It's lawmaking that creates the Atomic Energy Commission. It's lawmaking that shapes the role of the Federal Reserve. It's lawmaking that shapes the Securities and Exchange Commission. And David, this is my last thing, David Nassau has this wonderful quote from Joe Kennedy, who was the first SEC commissioner, who said, this is to no analytical point, I'm telling you this, just because I like the story. He says, now that I've been SEC commissioner, I'm no longer investing in the stock market, because all the tricks I used to get rich are no longer available. So sometimes it's the insulated part of the state, more than the procedural open part, that sometimes ends up controlling capital and property and putting constraints on it. So the story would be much more complex than the labels in the CNN headline news version of the book would give us. So thank you all.
When choosing people for a forum like this, you have to choose somebody who's written a fantastic book that has real ramifications and implications for our contemporary period, but you also need to have somebody who can respond to the likes of these three characters. They're incisive, astute, challenging questions, and Ira is clearly the man for that, who's able with great humility not to shed any tears, but to smile and joke his way through the responses. Thank you very much, Ira.